In 1824, when most of America was still untamed wilderness, a single land grant carved out nearly 300,000 acres on the far frontier, launching Bell Ranch into history. Over 2 centuries, this cattle kingdom has survived 3 different governments, Apache raids that turned neighbors into casualties, and financial disasters that erased ranches 10 times its size. Today, the same brand still burns onto hides, the same land still tests every generation, and the world still does not know how any of it was possible. This is Inside Bell Ranch, 200 years and 290,000 acres of American survival. So what does it really take to endure when almost nothing else does? On November 8, 1824, Pablo Montoya stepped into the council chambers of Santa Fe with a request that defied the norms of his era. He petitioned the territorial deputation for a grant of land so immense it would span nearly 655,000 acres, an expanse that dwarfed most private holdings in the Americas. 11 days later, the council approved his claim, transforming a sweep of New Mexico's high plains and canyons into a private domain larger than many eastern states. The decree, signed under the authority of the newly independent Mexican Republic, granted Montoya not just land but a kingdom in all but name. The legal framework behind this act was Mexico's General Colonization Law, passed only months earlier in August 1824, which aimed to populate and secure the northern frontier. The government, anxious to assert control over lands threatened by indigenous resistance and foreign ambition, offered vast tracts to settlers willing to risk the unknown. While the law typically set limits, 11 square leagues, about 48,000 acres, Montoya's grant exceeded those boundaries by more than tenfold. His standing as alcalde of Santa Fe and his connections within the territorial administration gave him the leverage to secure what others could not. The approval came with conditions familiar to frontier grants: the expectation that Montoya's family would defend the land and bring it into productive use, serving as a living bulwark for the Mexican state. The paperwork itself, preserved in a chain of Spanish and Mexican legal tradition, reads like a contract between a restless nation and a man willing to gamble his legacy. The boundaries were described in broad strokes, anchored by natural markers, rivers, mesas, and the bell-shaped mountain that would give the ranch its name. There were no fences, only the promise of presence and the hope that settlement would bring stability. The grant covered rolling grassland, rimrock canyons, and the winding course of La Cinta Creek, territory that had been traversed by the Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache for generations. Montoya's leap was more than ambition. It was a wager on survival at the edge of an empire. The Mexican government's strategy was clear: populate the frontier, create self-sustaining communities, and rely on grantees to hold the line where military garrisons could not. For Montoya and his family, the grant meant uprooting from the relative safety of Santa Fe and staking their future on a landscape as unpredictable as the politics of the new republic. The land was both opportunity and obligation, a place where the rewards of ownership came with the daily risk of loss. By the end of 1824, the Bell Ranch existed on paper and in the imagination of its new owners. The legal title was a promise, but the reality waiting on the plains was far from secure. Montoya's signature on the grant was an act of faith in the law, in the endurance of his family, and in the possibility that a single decision could shape not just his own destiny, but the fate of a region for centuries to come. Long before surveyors pressed their maps onto this land, the high plains and canyons of northeastern New Mexico belonged to no one and everyone. Each spring, the wind swept over grasslands broken by mesas and the solitary shadow of Bell Mountain. La Cinta Creek, winding through the heart of the future ranch, offered water in a country where rain could vanish for months. The Mexican Council's decree in 1824 drew new boundaries, but on the ground, the land answered to older rhythms. The ground Montoya claimed was not a blank slate. For generations, the Comanche, Kiowa, and Kiowa Apache moved through these valleys and across the open range. Buffalo herds shaped their migrations. Seasonal camps rose along the creek banks, and turowine and trails cut through the grass where horses and families traveled together. The Canadian River Corridor was more than a landmark. It was a lifeline, a route for trade, war, and survival. Petroglyphs on distant canyon walls, hidden in the folds of red rock, stood as silent records of lives lived before the ink dried on any land grant. In the early 19th century, this region sat at the edge of Comancheria, a domain held by force and reputation. Comanche bands, numbering in the thousands, rode from the Arkansas River down into the Texas Panhandle and across into New Mexico. Their allies, the Kiowa and Kiowa Apache, shared these hunting grounds, each group staking seasonal claims, each defending their share of grass and water. The land itself was divided not by fences but by memory, alliance, and the unspoken rules of the plains. The promise of the Bell Grant was always shadowed by risk. Mexican officials in Santa Fe understood it. They granted such vast acreage precisely because they needed settlers to stand as a human buffer against raids. The grant's boundaries, anchored by rivers and the bell-shaped peak, cut through territory where no government's word held sway for long. Montoya's deed was a wager against the unknown, a legal claim staked in the face of a landscape that had never been tamed. This was a place where a sudden storm could strip the grass bare, where waterholes dried to cracked mud, and where a rider could vanish without a trace. The same grass that promised wealth for cattle was also the draw for buffalo herds and the people who followed them. Every new structure, every corral, every adobe wall stood exposed, not just to weather, but to the possibility of conflict. The land did not yield easily. It demanded vigilance, endurance, and the constant awareness that every gain could be swept away overnight. On paper, the Bell Ranch began as a bold stroke, an empire measured in leagues. In reality, it was a patchwork of hope and hazard, a frontier where the line between opportunity and danger blurred with each passing season. The land kept its own counsel, indifferent to the ambitions of newcomers, holding the memory of those who had come before and the warning that nothing here was ever truly secure. Night on the high plains brought no peace for the families who tried to stake their future on the Bell Ranch. In 1874, the land's promise of wealth turned suddenly to terror. 4 vaqueros, seasoned riders who knew every bend of La Cinta Creek, failed to return from their work. Their bodies were found days later, stripped of their gear, their horses gone. The killing sent a shock through the adobe walls of the ranch house, a reminder that out here, the law's reach faded long before the horizon. The attackers were Kiowa warriors, moving fast and silent across the same grasslands that had fed their people for generations. They struck not out of random violence, but from a deep well of grievance over vanished buffalo herds and broken promises. For the men and women of the Bell, the threat was constant. Every trip to check a waterhole or gather strays meant scanning the ridgelines for movement, listening for the sound of hoofbeats that didn't belong. The adobe headquarters became a fortress. Windows were set high and narrow, doors barred at sundown. Children learned to stay low, to run for the thickest walls at the first sign of dust on the horizon. At night, the adults took turns on watch, rifles propped by the door, every shadow outside a possible warning. The land that had been granted as a reward for courage now demanded it every day. News of the killing spread quickly through the scattered settlements of northeastern New Mexico. Some families packed what they could carry and left, unwilling to gamble another season against the odds. Others dug in, determined to hold what they had built, but knowing each day might bring another raid. For the Montoya heirs, the loss was more than personal. It was the breaking point. The promise of the Bell, so grand on parchment, had become a burden too heavy to bear. The deaths of the 4 vaqueros forced a reckoning. The Montoya family, who who had survived drought, legal battles, and the uncertainties of changing governments, now faced a threat that no document could resolve. They chose to sell, ending their chapter on the land. The Bell Ranch passed into new hands, but the memory of that night, of the bodies found in the grass, of the fear that settled over the adobe walls, lingered long after. On this frontier, survival was never guaranteed, and every gain could be swept away in a single, silent raid. Wilson Waddingham arrived at Bell Ranch in the mid-1870s with a vision that reached beyond mere survival. The land had already tasted blood and loss, but Waddingham saw potential where others saw only risk. In 1875, he took a step that would secure the ranch's identity for generations. He registered the Bell brand, a simple iron mark shaped after the mountain that had watched over these grasslands since before the first fence post. That brand, filed in San Miguel County, became more than a mark of ownership. It was a declaration that Bell Ranch cattle would carry a legacy across every mile they traveled, unmistakable in crowded rail yards and on distant ranges. The act of branding was both practical and symbolic. In a territory where livestock theft was a constant threat and legal boundaries blurred with each new government, a registered brand served as a shield. The 1875 patent records show the Bell mark as one of the earliest continuous brands in the American West, offering legal footing in an era when property could vanish overnight. Branding laws in New Mexico territory were still evolving, but the Bell brand's distinct shape made it difficult to alter or forge. It protected herds from rustlers and gave buyers confidence in the cattle's origin. A crucial advantage as railroads pushed deeper into the frontier and the market for beef expanded eastward. Waddingham's approach to ownership was as modern as it was resolute. He brought capital from England, invested in breeding programs and improved range management, but he understood that the heart of any ranch was its reputation. The Bell brand became a promise, a guarantee that each animal was raised on these high plains, shaped by the same wind and weather that had tested every owner before him. As the ranch grew, so did the meaning of the brand. It was stamped not just on cattle, but on saddles, gates, and the very identity of the people who worked the land. Legal victories followed. The brand's registration gave the ranch standing in territorial courts, allowing Waddingham to defend his stock and land against encroachment in ways the previous owners could not. Where the Montoya family had relied on personal alliances and fragile paper grants, Waddingham built a system rooted in law and commerce. The Bell Ranch, once a vulnerable outpost, now stood as a recognized enterprise. Its boundaries mapped, its herds accounted for, its name respected from Santa Fe to Kansas City. The legacy of the Bell brand endures. It remains one of the oldest uninterrupted cattle brands in America, a living link to the era when survival meant more than holding land. It meant proving, season after season, that your claim would outlast drought, war, and the shifting currents of history. Waddingham's decision to formalize the brand was a turning point, transforming the ranch from a fragile inheritance into an enduring symbol of American ranching. Today, every new calf branded at Bell carries a piece of that legacy, proof that some marks are made to last. By the early 1930s, the Bell Ranch faced a test that toppled countless others across the West. Beef prices had collapsed, drought gripped the high plains, and most ranchers in New Mexico found themselves staring down debts they could not pay. Yet while neighbors sold off herds and watched their land slip away at auction, Bell Ranch made a different wager. In 1932, the board brought in Albert Mitchell, a college-educated manager barely 30, to run the operation for the Red River Valley Company. Mitchell's approach was anything but conventional. He split his time between Bell and his family's Tequesquite Ranch, piloting his own plane to scout grass and water from the air, a rare sight in those days. Mitchell refused to let drought or market panic dictate the ranch's future. When local forage vanished, He sent Bell cattle to graze in neighboring states, then as far as California and Pennsylvania. The logistics were daunting, but the alternative was liquidation, a fate that met too many ranches during those lean years. At the same time, Mitchell turned his attention to the ranch's backbone, its infrastructure. Corrals and wells that had fallen into neglect were rebuilt. Fences went up where none had stood before, dividing pastures to make the most of every blade of grass. Government programs swept across the plains, buying up inferior cattle and thinning herds. But Bell Ranch held on to its best stock, culling only what was necessary to keep the core strong. The Agricultural Adjustment Act brought a measure of relief, but survival still depended on hard decisions made at the ranch headquarters. Through it all, payrolls were met, families stayed on, and the brand endured. By the time the war years brought rain and rising prices, Bell Ranch was ready. The improvements made during the darkest years meant that when buyers came calling in 1947, the ranch stood as one of the few operations to emerge stronger than before. The quiet resolve of managers like Mitchell and the willingness to invest in the land even when hope seemed thin became the unseen engine of the ranch's survival. At Bell Ranch, the Bell brand is more than a mark. It is a living story, hammered into iron, pressed into hide, and carried forward by every generation that works these plains. The original branding iron, registered in San Miguel County in 1875, is still legal for use today. Each spring, the crew gathers at the headquarters, the same way their predecessors did nearly a century and a half ago, ready to brand the new calves. The fire crackles, irons glow, and the rhythm of work echoes across 290,000 acres, land stitched together by more than 530 miles of dirt roads, every mile a testament to the scale of daily life here. Modern Bell cowboys see themselves as stewards of something greater than the cattle or the grass. The brand book, kept meticulously up to date, records every animal marked with the bell, every lineage tracked, every promise kept. For these men and women, branding day is not just a job. It is a ritual of belonging, a handshake with the past. The same iron that once protected herds from rustlers now stands as a symbol of continuity. In an industry where change is constant and survival is never guaranteed, conservation is woven into their ethic. The land is managed with an eye for the long haul, rotational grazing, water management, careful stewardship of fragile grasslands. The Bell crew knows that the privilege of working here comes with the burden of responsibility. They speak about the future with the same respect they give the past, understanding that this place endures only as long as each generation tends both cattle and country with equal care. On branding day, when the smoke rises and the calves bawl, the weight of history is felt in every movement. The Bell iron leaves its mark, just as it did in 1875, and the circle of tradition closes once more, unbroken, unyielding, and unmistakably Bell. In 1824, the Bell Ranch began as a Mexican land grant spanning over 655,000 acres, an expanse larger than Rhode Island. For 2 centuries, it has survived 3 governments, Apache raids, and the economic devastation that erased most of its peers. The original Bell brand, registered in 1875, still marks cattle raised on 290,100 acres today. Archival documents confirm vaquero deaths during frontier conflict, land patents signed in 1869, and the continuous operation through the Great Depression and modern ownership transitions. Yet, questions remain. Not all records from the Apache era have survived, and some details of water rights battles are still buried in county archives. What is certain is this: Bell Ranch is not just a business that beat the odds. It is a living record of American endurance, where documented tradition and stewardship carry forward across generations and changing frontiers. The evidence stands. On this land, history endures in every mile of fence and every mark of the Bell brand.